The silk of the red dress felt like a lie against her skin. It was a beautiful lie, a sheath of crimson that clung to the generous curves of her body, but a lie nonetheless. It spoke of confidence, of power, of a woman who chose to be seen. Eleanor chose none of it. The dress, the dinner, the man sitting opposite her whose stillness was more frightening than any shouted threat, it had all been chosen for her. Her father, Arthur Vance, dabbed at his brow with a linen napkin, the gesture failing to conceal the tremor in his hand. He was a man accustomed to boardrooms and leveraged buyouts, but in the presence of Dante Moretti, he was reduced to a supplicant. Dante did not look at her father. His gaze, the color of wet slate, was fixed on Eleanor. It was not a look of desire or even assessment. It was the look of a man inventorying a new acquisition. She had been briefed in clipped, terrified tones by her father that morning. His shipping business was a hollowed-out shell, propped up by loans from the wrong people. Dante Moretti was the man who held the markers, the man whose patience had finally, irrevocably, run out. But he had offered a solution. Not more time. Not a percentage. A trade. Her, for the erasure of a debt so vast it could swallow their family whole. Eleanor had heard the whispers about her whole life. The pitying glances at society functions. The cruel jokes from boys who would never ask her to dance. The constant, suffocating concern from her own mother about her weight, as if it were a moral failing instead of just the shape of her body. She had built walls around herself, brick by brick, with books and art and a quiet, unshakable competence in the world of histories and artifacts her father had once funded. Now those walls were being torn down, and she was being served up as the sacrificial lamb. However, the man across the table was not what she expected. There was no flashy jewelry, no ostentatious swagger. He wore a charcoal suit of such perfect tailoring it seemed a part of him, a dark gray shirt, and no tie. His hands, resting on the white tablecloth, were large and still, a heavy gold signet ring on his right pinky finger the only ornament. He moved with an unnerving economy, a predator's stillness that promised lethal speed. "The arrangement is simple, Mr. Vance," Dante said, his voice a low baritone that cut through the restaurant's quiet murmur. He still had not looked at her father. His eyes were on her. "Your ledgers are wiped clean. All debts to my organization are forgiven. In return, I take your daughter as my wife." Arthur swallowed audibly. "Yes, of course. She's a good girl. Well-educated." Eleanor felt a hot flush of shame, not for herself, but for her father's pathetic attempt to sell her qualities like a list of features on a car. She straightened her spine, the motion drawing Dante's gaze from her face to the line of her throat. "I'm not interested in her education," Dante said, the words precise and cold. "I'm interested in the alliance this marriage represents. A permanent bond between the Vance name and my own. It will be seen. It will be understood." He was talking about legitimacy. Her father's name, though tarnished with debt, still carried a whisper of old East Coast establishment. It was a name that opened doors Dante's could only kick down. She was the key. She decided then that she would not be silent. She would not be a piece of property bartered without a voice. She met his gaze directly, refusing to flinch. "And what do I get out of this arrangement, Mr. Moretti?" The question hung in the air, thick and dangerous. Her father paled, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. But Dante's expression did not change. For the first time, a flicker of something other than cold transaction entered his eyes. Curiosity. "You get to live," he said simply. "And your father does, too." The bluntness of it was a physical blow. This was not a negotiation. It was a surrender. The waiter arrived with their orders, a silent, ghost-like figure who placed the plates down and vanished without a word, sensing the lethal tension at the table. Eleanor looked at her plate of roasted fish and vegetables, her appetite gone. She thought of all the years she had spent making herself small, trying to take up less space in a world that told her she took up too much. Now, her very existence was the centerpiece of the most important deal of her father's life. The irony was suffocating. She picked up her fork. She would eat. She would sit here in this beautiful, lying red dress, and she would perform the part of the willing bride-to-be, because the alternative was unthinkable. But as she raised the first bite to her lips, she felt Dante's eyes on her still.
He was not eating.
He was watching her, his focus absolute, as if trying to solve a puzzle. That was the moment she understood. He was not marrying her despite her size. He was not overlooking it. He had chosen her specifically. A woman who was not a typical society beauty, a woman the world had deemed unworthy, would be entirely his. She would have no other suitors, no lingering affections, no social capital of her own. She was a blank slate upon which he could write his claim. She was safe. She was controllable. She thought she understood the terms of her cage. It would be gilded, luxurious, and lonely. She would be a wife in name only, a symbol of a business deal.
She could live with that.
She had been living with loneliness her whole life. But as they left the restaurant, the reality of her new world crashed down upon her. 2 black sedans waited at the curb, engines humming. As one of Dante's men opened the door for them, a man in a rumpled suit broke from the crowd on the sidewalk, shouting Dante's name. Before he could take a second step, 2 of Dante's guards moved. It was not a brawl. It was a piece of brutal, silent choreography. One guard stepped in front of the man, blocking his path, while the other came from behind, an arm snaking around his throat. The man's shout was cut off into a strangled gurgle. He was lifted from his feet and half-dragged, half-carried into the darkness of a nearby alley. There was no sound.
No struggle.
Just a man who was there one moment and gone the next. Dante did not even turn his head. He simply placed a firm, cool hand on the small of Eleanor's back, guiding her into the car as if nothing had happened. The touch was impersonal, a mere steering mechanism, but it sent a jolt through her. The car door shut, sealing them in a cocoon of leather and silence. Her father was in the other car. It was just her and Dante in the back seat. She stared out the window, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had thought this was a corporate merger with unusually high stakes. She was wrong. This was not business. This was war. And she had just been moved to the front line. The penthouse was a monument to cold, masculine taste. Vast open spaces, floors of polished black marble, and floor-to-ceiling windows that displayed the glittering tapestry of the New York skyline. It was beautiful, sterile, and utterly devoid of warmth. It was a fortress in the sky, and now it was her home. Dante gave her a brief, perfunctory tour. Her bedroom was a suite larger than her old apartment, with a bathroom clad in Italian marble and a closet filled with clothes in her size, all bearing designer labels she had only ever seen in magazines. It was a perfect, luxurious prison. "My men are downstairs," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous living room. "You will not leave without one of them. For your protection." "Protection from what?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "From the consequences of being my wife," he replied, without a trace of irony. He turned to leave her, his presence already receding. "Dante," she said, and the use of his first name made him pause, his back still to her. "This will not work if I am only a prisoner." He turned slowly. "What do you suggest?" She gestured to the walls, bare except for a few large, imposing abstract paintings. "This place, it's not a home. It's a vault. People will come here. They will need to believe this is a real marriage. It needs to look like 1 inch." He considered this, his gray eyes sweeping over the room and then back to her. "What are you proposing, Eleanor?" The way he said her name was different now. Less like a word on a page, more like he was testing its weight on his tongue. "I studied art history. Curation," she said, the words feeling small in the vast space. "Let me make this place a home. Let me give it a soul. It will make the lie more believable." A long silence stretched between them. She expected him to refuse, to dismiss her as a foolish woman talking about decor. Instead, he gave a single, sharp nod. "There is a collection in storage. My father's. Do what you will with it." It was the first crack in the facade. The first time he had given her something other than an order. It was a task, a leash, but it was also an opportunity. The collection was delivered the next day in a series of climate-controlled trucks. Crates filled a spare room, the air suddenly smelling of old canvas and varnish. She spent days unpacking, cataloging, and researching. It was a mix of genuine minor masterpieces and sentimental landscapes, a map of his father's tastes. And in working with his family's history, she began to understand the man himself. The paintings he favored were severe, disciplined. The ones he ignored were full of life and chaos. One evening, he found her in the makeshift studio, staring at a small portrait of a young man with dark, laughing eyes, painted in a style that was a passable imitation of a lesser-known Dutch master. "That one is a fake," he said from the doorway. He was holding 2 glasses of amber liquid. He walked over and handed one to her. She took a sip. Whiskey. It burned a clean, hot line down her throat. "I know," she said. "The brushwork in the lace collar is too precise for the period." The artist was showing off. A real 17th century painter would have been more concerned with the cost of the pigment. Dante looked at the painting, and for the first time, she saw a shadow of something other than command in his face. It was a deep, ancient sadness. "It was a gift," he said, his voice quiet. "For my brother, Marco. He bought it for me when I made my first million. He had a bad eye for art. A worse eye for men." Eleanor said nothing. She knew the story from the whispers she had pieced together online. Marco Moretti, Dante's older, wilder brother, killed in a deal gone wrong years ago. A deal that Dante had warned him against. It was his wound, the failure he carried in the silence of his fortress. "The man who sold it to him," Dante continued, his voice hardening again, "was an associate of the Falcone family. Our primary rivals. It was an insult, passing off this garbage. A test." Marco didn't see it. Eleanor looked from the painting to Dante's face. She saw the guilt that lived behind his eyes. He had not been able to protect his brother. Therefore, he would control everything and everyone else in his life with absolute, suffocating authority, including her. She reached out, her fingers hovering just over the canvas. "The forgery is an insult, yes. But the intent behind the gift was real.
Your brother saw you, Dante.
He wanted to give you something that reflected the world you were building." He looked at her then, a long, searching look that made her feel as though he were seeing past the red dress, past the convenient shape of her body, and into the careful, ordered rooms of her mind. "You see things other people miss," he stated. It was not a compliment. It was an observation. A potentially dangerous one. He finished his whiskey in one swallow, set the glass down with a soft click, and left her alone with the ghost in the painting. That night, she couldn't sleep. The silence of the penthouse was too loud. She found herself in the kitchen at 3 a.m, staring out at the city lights. She heard a floorboard creak behind her.
It was Dante.
He was dressed in a pair of dark sweatpants and a plain t-shirt, the first time she had seen him in anything other than a suit. The casual attire made him seem both younger and more dangerous. He said nothing, simply walked to the refrigerator and took out a bottle of water. He opened it and handed it to her. His fingers brushed hers, a brief, electric touch. It was a simple, practical gesture, an almost deniable act of care. But in the cold, silent world of their arrangement, it felt like a seismic shift. She took the water, her throat suddenly dry. "Thank you." He leaned against the counter opposite her, the space between them charged with unspoken things. "The Falcones are getting bold," he said, changing the subject back to the familiar ground of his war. "Sending messages. Like that fake painting." "There may be other messages," she said, thinking of the collection. "In the art, provenance is a paper trail. It tells a story. Who owned it, when, where it was sold. It can expose connections people want to keep hidden." He watched her, his head tilted slightly. "You will look through the entire collection. Every piece. Find their stories." It was an order, but it felt like something more. He was giving her a weapon. He was trusting her to wield it. She was no longer just the wife, the symbol. She was becoming an asset. Therefore, she was becoming more valuable. And infinitely more entangled in his dangerous life. The days that followed fell into a strange rhythm. Eleanor worked in her studio, surrounded by the ghosts of Dante's family, tracing the lineage of each painting and sculpture. He would appear at odd hours, watching her work in silence, a dark, looming presence. They rarely spoke of anything personal, yet a strange sort of intimacy grew in those quiet hours. She learned the sound of his footsteps, the scent of cedar and faint, clean gunpowder that clung to him, the way a muscle in his jaw would tighten when he was displeased. She discovered he was right. The collection was riddled with messages. A landscape from a gallery known for laundering Falcone money. A sculpture acquired from a dealer who had mysteriously vanished after a deal with Dante's father went sour. It was a history of his family's wars, written in oil and marble. One night, while researching the provenance of a heavy Renaissance-era desk that had belonged to his father, her fingers found a false bottom in a drawer. Inside was not art, but ledgers. Old, leather-bound books filled with handwritten entries. Her heart pounded as she opened the first one. It was not art inventory. It was a meticulous record of his entire operation, stretching back years. Names, dates, shipments. The cold, hard accounting of his criminal empire. She saw payments to judges, shipping manifests for illegal arms, and brutal, one-line entries detailing the enforcement of his will. This was it. The thing that should make her run screaming. The proof that the quiet, controlled man she was married to was a monster. She should have been terrified.
She was.
But beneath the fear was a jolt of something else. A kind of horrified fascination. The sheer scale of it, the discipline, the absolute control. She spent the next 2 nights poring over the books when Dante was out, cross-referencing names and dates with her art research. And then she found it.
An anomaly.
A series of payments to a shell corporation linked to the Falcones, hidden within the accounts for art restoration. The amounts were small, but the pattern was consistent. Someone on the inside was skimming. Someone was betraying him. The signature authorizing the payments was clear.
Luca Giordano.
Dante's underboss. The man he treated like a younger brother, the one who had taken Marco's place at his side. Eleanor felt a wave of nausea. This was a death sentence. For Luca, if he was discovered. For her, if Dante ever found out she had seen these books. She had a choice. She could pretend she never found them. She could try to find a way to escape.
Or.
She made her choice. The next evening, when Dante returned, she was waiting for him in his study, one of the ledgers open on the polished surface of his desk. He stopped dead in the doorway, his eyes going from her face to the book. The air in the room grew cold, heavy. Every instinct screamed at her to run. "I found it in your father's desk," she said, her voice a low, steady thing she did not recognize. "I think you need to see this." He walked to the desk, his movements slow, deliberate. He did not look at her. He looked at the open page, at the damning signature. For a full minute he was utterly still. The silence was the most terrifying thing she had ever experienced. When he finally spoke, his voice was dangerously soft. "You know what this means. I know that you have a traitor in your house," she said. She had crossed the line. She was no longer an unwilling participant. She was an accomplice. She was helping him protect his criminal enterprise. He closed the book. Then he looked at her, and his eyes were chips of ice. "No one can know you saw this. No 1 inch." The threat was implicit, but so was something else.
Trust.
He was not going to kill her for what she knew. He was going to use it. The consequences of her discovery came faster than she could have imagined. 2 days later, she was granted a rare excursion, a trip to a specialist library to research a particular artist's signature. She was flanked by 2 of Dante's most trusted men, but for the first time in weeks, she breathed air that did not belong to the penthouse. On the drive back, a black town car swerved aggressively behind them, ramming their rear bumper. Her driver cursed, accelerating, but the town car kept pace, slamming into them again. It was not road rage.
It was an attack.
The world dissolved into a blur of screeching tires and shattering glass as her driver tried to lose them on the slick city streets. He took a sharp turn into a narrow service alley, but the town car followed, pinning them against a brick wall. Men in dark clothes spilled out, weapons drawn. One of her guards shoved her down onto the floor of the back seat. "Stay down," he yelled, as he and the driver opened their doors, guns already in their hands. The alley erupted in a cacophony of gunfire. She huddled on the floor, the smell of cordite sharp in her nostrils, her body trembling. She thought of the red dress, of the quiet life she had lost. She thought of Dante's cold, gray eyes. The gunfire stopped as abruptly as it began. There was a sickening silence. Then, she heard the sound of another car, screeching to a halt at the mouth of the alley. She heard a car door slam. A voice, low and full of cold fury, cut through the silence. Dante's voice. More shots echoed, precise and final. The back door was wrenched open. Dante stood there, his suit immaculate, a pistol in his hand, looking down at her. His face was a mask of stone, but for a split second, before the mask slammed back into place, she saw it. Raw, undiluted fear. The terror of almost losing something he had claimed. He reached in and pulled her out of the car, his grip on her arm bruising. He didn't say a word, just steered her toward his car, shielding her body with his own. His men were dealing with the aftermath, the bodies, the evidence. She did not look back. Back in the penthouse, the adrenaline still sang in her veins. He poured her a brandy, his hands steady. He said nothing about the attack, about the men who had died protecting her. He stood in front of her, so close she could feel the heat coming off him. "They will not touch you again," he said, his voice a raw promise. It was not a comfort. It was a vow of annihilation, sworn on her behalf. It was the most honest thing he had ever said to her. "I know," she whispered, and the words were an acceptance. Of him, of this life, of her place in it. This was their confession. Not of love, but of something far more dangerous. A shared fate. She thought this shared violence would bring them closer, that this brutal baptism had forged a new kind of bond between them. She thought he would see her as his partner, his ally in the war the Falcons had now brought to her doorstep. But he did the opposite. He pulled away. The near loss had not solidified their alliance. It had reminded him of his vulnerability. It had reminded him of Marco. He became colder, more distant than ever. Her world shrank again. The penthouse became her entire universe, the guards at the door a constant reminder that she was not his partner, but his most valuable, most vulnerable possession. The intimacy they had found in quiet rooms and shared secrets was gone, replaced by the sterile reality of her gilded cage. He had made a promise to protect her, but he was doing it by locking her away from the world and from himself. Dante was preparing for war. The attack on Eleanor was a direct challenge from the Falcone family, a message that they were not afraid to strike at what was his. A sit-down was arranged, a meeting of the two families brokered by the Commission, the ruling body of their world. It was meant to be a negotiation, a way to avoid all-out bloodshed. Eleanor knew it was a trap. Dante was convinced that Luca, his underboss, was the traitor who had given the Falcons her location. He planned to expose him at the meeting, to use the betrayal as leverage. He was cold, focused, and absolutely certain he was in control. He left for the meeting, leaving Eleanor under heavy guard. "Stay here. Do not leave this room," he commanded.
It was not a request.
He kissed her then, a hard, brief press of his lips against hers. It was not a kiss of affection. It was a brand, a mark of ownership before he went into battle. As soon as he was gone, a cold dread settled over her. Something was wrong. His certainty felt like a weakness. She went back to her studio, to the notes she had made from the ledgers and the provenance research. She stared at the authorization signature from Luca, the one that had condemned him. Then she looked at the file she had on the forged Dutch portrait, the one Marco had given him. The forger had a specific, arrogant flourish in his brushwork. A tiny, almost invisible detail in the way he painted fabric. She had seen it before. Her blood ran cold. She scrambled through her files, pulling out the restoration documents for a different painting, a seascape Dante's father had acquired years ago. The payments for that restoration, perfectly legitimate ones, had been authorized by a different man, a man long dead. But the restorer's signature on the invoice, it had the same arrogant flourish as the forger's brushwork. And the signature on the invoice was not Luca Giordano's. It was his father's. Luca's father had been the forger, the swindler working with the Falcones for decades, a betrayal that ran deeper than Dante could ever imagine. Luca was not the traitor. He was the cover. He had been signing off on small, insignificant payments to the same shell corporation his father had used, a foolish, sentimental attempt to maintain a connection to his dead father's legacy, without knowing its true, treacherous nature. The real traitor, the one who had been feeding the Falcones information for years, the one who knew all of Dante's secrets, was someone else entirely. Someone who had access to both the old ledgers and Dante's current plans. Someone who would benefit from a war between the Morettis and the Falcones. It had to be Nico, Dante's chief of security. The man who had organized her transport. The man who now stood outside her door. Dante was walking into an ambush, and the man he trusted with his life was the one who had set the trap. She had to warn him. She went to the door, but the guards, Nico's men, would not let her pass. They were polite, but their eyes were hard. She was a prisoner. Panic clawed at her throat, but she forced it down. She was not the helpless girl her father had sold. She was Dante Moretti's wife. She had learned to see things other people missed. She had to think. She went to the kitchen, her mind racing. A direct confrontation was impossible. She needed a diversion. She looked at the heavy, professional-grade stovetop. She turned on the gas on all 6 burners, letting it flood the air for a moment before she threw a wet dish towel onto a hot pan. The smoke was immediate and thick. She then smashed the glass of the nearest fire alarm. The shriek of the alarm was deafening. Red lights flashed. Within seconds, the guards burst in, their faces tight with alarm. "There's a fire," she screamed, coughing for effect. Chaos erupted. The building's automated systems kicked in, sprinklers hissing to life. The guards were distracted, trying to locate the source of the smoke, shouting into their radios. In the confusion, only one person remained focused on her. Not Nico's men, but an older guard, a man named Sal, who had been with Dante's father. She had seen the way he looked at Dante, with a fierce, paternal loyalty that went beyond a paycheck. She ran to him, grabbing his arm. "It's a lie. There's no fire. It's Nico. He's the traitor. He set Dante up. You have to get me to him.
Now."
Sal's eyes widened, first in disbelief, then in dawning horror. He had seen the way Nico had risen through the ranks, his ambition a sharp, ugly thing. He made a split-second decision. He grabbed her hand. "Come on." He led her through the chaos, down a service stairwell, bypassing the compromised security team. He got them to a car in the garage and tore out into the city streets, driving with a reckless urgency that terrified and thrilled her. The sit-down was at a deserted warehouse on the Brooklyn waterfront. They arrived to a scene of unnatural quiet. Sal got on his personal phone, calling a number he knew would go directly to a man loyal only to Dante inside the warehouse. Eleanor gave him the message. It was all she could do. Tell him the forger's son is a fool, not a traitor. The snake is the one he left guarding his house. They waited, the seconds stretching into an eternity. Then, the warehouse doors exploded outward. The night was ripped apart by the roar of automatic weapons. Sal threw her to the floor of the car, covering her with his body. When the shooting finally stopped, the silence that fell was profound, final. Men emerged from the warehouse, Dante's men. They were bloodied but victorious. And then Dante himself appeared in the doorway, a dark silhouette against the light inside. He saw the car, saw her. He walked toward them, his face grim, his suit stained with blood that was not his own. He pulled her from the car, his hands gripping her shoulders. He searched her face, his gray eyes blazing with 1,000 questions. "Nico," he asked, his voice rough. "And Luca's father," she said, her voice shaking. The betrayal was generational. He closed his eyes for a moment. The cost of the night was written on his face. He had been forced to kill men he had trusted. He had nearly lost everything because he had been blind. But he was alive. And she was the reason. They drove back to the penthouse in silence. The place was a wreck, soaked from the sprinklers, the smell of smoke still hanging in the air. The disloyal guards were gone. Only Dante's most trusted men remained, cleaning up the mess. He led her into his study, the one room that was untouched, and closed the door. He stood before her, the grime and violence of the night still clinging to him. He looked exhausted, older. "You saved my life," he said.
It was a simple statement of fact.
"You are my husband," she replied. "Your life is my life." That was the arrangement. A flicker of something, a ghost of a smile, touched his lips. I don't think either of us understood the terms of the arrangement. He walked to the safe hidden behind a painting and pulled out a heavy, velvet box. He opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded silk, was a signet ring, identical to the one he wore, but older, the gold worn smooth with time. "This was my father's," he said, "and his father's before him. It belongs to the head of the family." He took the ring from the box. He did not put it on her finger. He placed it in the palm of her hand. It was heavy, freighted with the weight of generations of blood and power. "In our world," he said, his voice low and intense, "there is the family you are born into and the family you make. The family you choose. Luca was like a brother to me, but he was weak. Nico, I trusted with my life, and he betrayed me. You were a debt, a piece of a contract." He reached out and gently cupped her face, his thumbs stroking her cheek. His touch was no longer impersonal. It was a claim. "You are not a debt anymore, Eleanor. You are my wife. My family." He leaned in and kissed her. It was not the hard, branding kiss from before. It was slow, deep, and devastatingly tender. It was a confession, a surrender, and a promise all at once. When he pulled away, she looked down at the ring in her hand. It was a crown, a burden, a weapon. She closed her fingers around the warm, heavy gold, accepting its weight. She had been sold to this man to pay a debt, a woman mocked for the space she occupied. Now, she stood at the center of his world, the queen in a violent, dangerous kingdom she had helped him save. The red dress had been a warning. The gold ring was her armor. And in the cold, gray eyes of the most feared man in New York, she finally saw a reflection of her own strength. She saw home.